As the U.S. becomes increasingly divided by partisan politics, we're seeing new forms of political ideology take hold. It's happening as the number of atheists, agnostics, and those who don't identify as anything at all spiritually grows rapidly in this country, drastically changing America's religious landscape. A new article in The Atlantic delves into why secularists who hoped a decline in religiosity would make for more rational politics might be a little disappointed. We want to bring in Shadi Hamid, who wrote that piece. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Thank you so much for joining us. This is very fascinating to me. I remember years and years ago reading an article, coincidentally, in The Atlantic, and one of the things this article was arguing was that societies that are more religious are also more susceptible to conspiracy theories, right? This idea that you can sort of make a leap of faith and believe something without actually seeing the facts. And what you sort of identify in your article is that over the past 2 decades, church membership has dropped significantly by 20%. You write that as Christianity's hold has weakened, rather, Christianity's hold in our sort of culture has weakened. People have sort of shifted. They have become religious about other things. Ideological intensity and fragmentation has risen instead. Why is that?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it's sort of one of these situations where you should be careful what you wish for. There's this secular fantasy that as people move away from religion, that they'll become more rational and reasonable, but that is not happening. People are still very intense about their beliefs, but they're channeling what used to be religious sentiment into politics. And we have to ask ourselves the question, should politics be treated basically as theology? Because religion can be very existential. It tends to arouse the passions. And when that's channeled into everyday politics or mundane policy debates, then it leads to more and more division and polarization. So this is part of what we're seeing with, say, like the rise of Trumpism or the rise of what might be called woke ideology on the left. Sometimes people call that, social justice warriors, that kind of thing, where there is the intensity is very much there, but it's about this world. It's about secular ideas. And it's sort of a puzzle of why this would be the case. I think one thing that I try to argue in the piece is that we as Americans have always been a nation of believers because unlike European countries, we don't have a long shared history. We don't have a shared ethnicity. If you look at Germany, for example, Germany is simply the land of the Germans. America is an ideological country because we believe in founding ideals and a founding creed. So to expect Americans to just stop believing and stop being intense is not realistic. So now as Christianity is declining, other things are filling the vacuum, and those other things aren't necessarily better.
So in your piece, according to your piece, American ideologies are filling the vacuum where religion once took hold. And as religious beliefs are channeled into other ideologies, you point out 2 rising convictions. One, the Trump-centric Christian nationalism and wokeism. Explain those concepts to us and how they came about. Because there's a lot of discussion now about wokeism, which is not really an ism. And, it's sort of interesting. You've got folks like Senator Tim Scott saying that wokeism is almost as bad as white supremacy. And wokeism didn't lynch people. Wokeism didn't prevent people from attending schools or sitting at lunch counters. So explain that to me.
Yeah, sure. Well, on the first side of it, if we look at Trumpism, and there are still a vast majority of evangelicals who are very supportive of Trump, as we know. And when you look at a Trump rally, they're not worshiping Jesus Christ. In some ways, their savior in this temporal world is Donald Trump. And there's something almost, obviously unreligious about that or problematic from a Christian standpoint. So that's changing in some ways how Christians approach politics. I don't want to draw a moral equivalency between Trumpism, which I think has been more dangerous, to kind of woke ideas, but wokeism can sort of mimic Christianity in certain ways, in that there are founding texts that you're supposed to read. There is atonement for past sins. There are very strict ways of approaching language, that there are these, new rules about how to talk about, and some of them are good, obviously, about talking about people of color, and other issues that are about identity and ethnicity. But there's a danger that when it goes too far, and one example that I bring up in the piece is almost a sense of treating Justice Ginsburg as a secular saint. That when people were dealing with her passing, it felt almost like it had this religious intensity. And I think that we always have to be careful about that, because politics, in my view, should stay in the realm of politics. Once it becomes almost like a theological issue, then you start to see your fellow Americans as enemies to be defeated. Or, so for example, if you're a woke person and you see the 74 million Trump voters, I mean, I personally disagree with those 74 million Trump voters, but they are still our fellow Americans. And is it healthy to see them as enemies, or people who are outside of the fold, or that they're un-American, or that they're bad Americans? And this is where I think we have to lower the stakes and lower the temperature, and still realize that there is something most of us share, and that is we do have a set of founding ideas. We don't agree on what it means to be American, but at least we believe that America is important as a set of founding ideals, even if we debate what those ideals are now every day.
And you also point out that this religious passion that we're now sort of putting elsewhere. It's not just about political philosophy. You cite Catholic philosopher Michael Novak in saying that America is almost a religion, and you talk about the fact that when people come here, immigrants come here, the expectation is that they become American. They embrace the philosophy. Americans move somewhere else. They live there for 30, 40 years. They're always expats. They're always Americans living somewhere else. National identity as a religion, where did this come from?
Yeah, so we're actually one of the very few countries in the world that is founded on a creed. And that is a very good thing. That's what makes us us. And we have our founding scriptures, if you will, to use the analogy, whether it's the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence. We have our founding fathers. A lot of other countries don't necessarily have founding fathers that they hold in this kind of reverence. And I bring up one example that, always struck me when I would come back after traveling abroad to the airport, and then the customs officer says, welcome home. And so it's a very powerful thing. And other countries, again, don't necessarily have this idea where, America is your home in this very deep sense, because we've become American. My parents immigrated from Egypt, and they were able to fully embrace the American idea and fall in love with their country. So that's where I end up on a sort of cautious note of hope that is still something that we have. And we have to remember that with all of our division and all the anger that we have one side to the other and vice versa, to kind of remember that there is something to be said for being American, and that there are still some shared ideas. Now, we have to have a conversation about why we don't agree on what it means to be American, because if you look at Trump voters, they'll say they're the true Americans and they represent the true ideas. And then if you talk to more progressive Americans, they have a different idea about where America should go in the coming years. And if that keeps on intensifying, then there is a risk of fragmentation. In the lead up to the election, the recent one, there was talk of civil conflict, even civil war. I thought that was a little bit too much. I don't think we're going to have that, but we can have, and we have had more political violence, and the Capitol riots were an example of that. So there is this fragmentation that is lurking in the background.
Yeah, it's such an interesting.
You see that in the debate over kneeling during the national anthem, right? That some argue that this is sort of a top example of being unpatriotic and un-American, and others say no. The whole point of one of the sort of tenets of being American is that you get to express yourself, and it's okay to criticize your own country. That's exactly what you're talking about. Sorry, Vlad.
No. To that point, to what you're referencing, the notion that civil discourse and civil disobedience and protesting what you believe is an injustice is exactly what this country was founded on. And you're right. It is fascinating to me that in this country there has always been this deification of political figures. As much as any American, I think what the founding fathers did is something that has never been equaled in the world. But you're right. The notion that we prop these men of a certain ethnicity and of a certain class as the all-defining notion of what is an American and what is not, I find it remarkable. Let's just talk about something that's in the press right now, this whole thing between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle and the royal family. Isn't it weird that you have these people who say that they are proud Americans, who have 1776 in their Twitter handles or in their Instagram handles, who are now becoming strict monarchists? And how dare Meghan Markle, try to change the royal family? Dude, you live in America. Like, what do we care about what the royal... But that just sort of tells you about how people perceive. Yeah. It's not about America. In my mind, it's become a debate as to who has power and who holds that power and what type of people hold that power. And that is what is becoming the definition of who is an American and who is not.
It's a really good point. I mean, exactly what you're saying is absurd to watch this debate around the Markle interview. But I mean, one thing I would just add is that what we used to have before church membership started to decline, and also I'm someone who likes Christianity, but I don't believe in it. I'm Muslim, so I'm sort of in this odd position of arguing that the decline of Christianity isn't necessarily a great thing. But what I think with the common Christian culture, that would temper some of the intensity, because one thing that religion at its best can do is that it postpones judgment until the next life. Not everything is about the here and now. It's God who renders judgment and not necessarily your fellow man. I mean, part of the problem with these new political religions now is that we're very intense about we want to judge or even punish our fellow Americans and excommunicate them from, say, progressivism, or we say that they are beyond the pale. And I don't want to exaggerate how bad cancel culture is. That can sometimes be a right-wing talking point. But I do think if you find someone who has a bad tweet from 10 years ago, that you don't give them any chance for forgiveness or mercy or grace. And that's one thing that Christianity has offered. I mean, obviously there can be a darker side of religion, but there's also that good side that allows us to treat our fellow citizens with a degree of forgiveness.
But Shadi, just one question about that before we wrap this up. It's interesting to me, having also lived abroad in many different countries, including in Asia, in Europe, and in Africa, that the decline of religion in Western countries, for example, is interesting to note as we see the rise of Christianity in Africa, in countries in Africa, and in Latin America. And what I would, when I lived in France, there was never, I mean, people still go to church, and people, France is a Catholic country, but it's not, religion isn't injected into politics to the extent that it is here in the United States. On the other hand, when I lived in Africa, religion, specifically in Nigeria, religion is very much a part of the political discourse in that country, and in some points, it can be a detriment because you have people that make decisions and people that behave in a certain way, laws that are passed that have more to do with religion than the rights of men and women.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And, you know, where I'm originally from, born and raised in the U.S., but in the Middle East, where my parents are from, we see the role of Islam playing an outsized role. And there's a big debate about whether there should be more privatization of religion or not. But I don't think secularism is the answer because, I mean, certainly if you look at countries like France or Germany, the loss of religion has led to detrimental development. So one reason it's harder to integrate Muslim immigrants in France or Germany, which is a big debate now, is because, you know, Muslims tend to be more religious on average if they're coming from Middle Eastern countries. And as you said, France is a very secular country, even if it's historically Catholic. And I think one of the great things about the U.S. is if you have more religious immigrants, either from Latin America or the Middle East, they can still feel comfortable expressing their religiosity publicly. They don't have to hide their religion or keep it private, and that makes it easier to integrate. So there is always going to be a dark side when you have maybe too much religion, but I think part of the American idea is that religion is part of freedom of expression and freedom of conscience, and our government, thank God, is not asking us to keep our religion hidden away, basically.
It's such a fascinating discussion, Shadi and Anne-Marie. And as you could tell, Shadi, we could keep talking to you for another half hour. Maybe we need to do a podcast. But
our producers want us to wrap up.
Yeah.
No, but we have 8 other questions.
You know, and one thing I also found kind of remarkable in France, just really quickly, was that, you know, I had some friends who were Jewish in France, and almost everybody that I met was observant. In other words, they looked at American Jews, those that are Reform Jews, sort of like in a unique way, that wasn't something that really was a thing in France because they're so small. The community is so small there. There's a lot of reasons. But it's such a fascinating discussion. I'm glad we were able to have you on, and maybe we can talk about it in the future again. Thank you, Shadi.
Would love to. Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Yeah, this is great.